If you're from the United States and I ask you to think of some Canadian cartoons, tell me what comes to mind. Probably Johnny Test, right? 16, George of the Jungle, maybe Totally Spies. You know, a lot of stuff that varies in quality, right? But what if I told you that there was a lot more to Canadian programming than the handful of shows you guys had down there in the States? I see a lot of TV and cartoon-focused YouTube channels really misconstrue the overarching quality of Canadian programming, often using Johnny Test and George of the Jungle as cherry-picked examples, but the reality is, we actually had a lot of dope shows in Canada that never aired or didn't air much in the United States. I'm a Canadian. I've spent my entire life here in Canada, and resulting from that, I, of course, watched a lot of Canadian television as a child. Every day after school, I'd park my ass down on that couch, I'd play my Game Boy Advance, and I'd watch YTV and Teletoon until bedtime. On basic Canadian cable, there were 3 main channels for youth programming: YTV, Teletoon, and the Family Channel, channels 27, 44, and 43. YTV stands for Youth Television. It had all of the Nickelodeon stuff like SpongeBob, Fairly Odd Parents, Rugrats, Jimmy Neutron, everything. You name it, it was probably on YTV. It did have some live action stuff too, like I remember Malcolm in the Middle would air later into the evening. And then there was the anime block, which would air on Friday nights. It was called Bionics. Think Toonami, pretty much the same thing as that. Now over on Teletoon, this is where you got everything Cartoon Network, like Ben 10, Foster's Home, K&D, and of course, Billy and Mandy. Some Cartoon Network stuff like Dexter's Lab, Samurai Jack, and Powerpuff Girls aired on YTV instead though, for some reason. And later into the evening, we'd have the Detour block, which is where the more adult-oriented programming would air. Think Adult Swim, you know, we'd get Tim and Eric, Futurama, Space Ghost, Robot Chicken, the list goes on. Family Channel was one I didn't really watch a whole lot of. It was mostly just Disney, and even as a kid, I didn't really have that much interest in Disney. The Weekenders was the absolute favorite of myself and everyone else I know around here though. I hear that one wasn't really that big in the US, but it was huge here in Nova Scotia. I also watched a lot of Recess, Lilo and Stitch, Kim Possible, and Fillmore, but not much outside of that. If you're like me and you grew up in the Great White North, it was probably these 3 channels you were mostly flicking between as a kid. And it's been a wild ride seeing these channels evolve over time, not just in what programming they air, but also the bumpers and the aesthetic of the channels themselves. YTV always boasted itself as being the more weirder channel. YTV's bumpers would often feature a variety in animation styles, oftentimes 3D with some strange-looking creature doing something weird, and then the logo appears. You know how we do There were a couple of programming blocks that, between shows, would feature a host to discuss the programming in question, fun toys and contests, sometimes even interviewing the people involved in the show. First of all, there was Vortex. This was all the Saturday morning stuff, which was mostly action cartoons. It was hosted by Stephanie Brochart, who was later replaced by Paula Lemire after her departure. Vortex was later on replaced by Crunch in 2006, hosted by AJ Fry and his head of ridiculously wacky hair. This dude went on to host Inner Space later on, and now he streams PUBG on Twitch. But the crown jewel of hosted programming on YTV was The Zone.
Whacked. It's weird, and it promises never to be a cooking show. Carl, that's not food. The Zone, Monday through Friday from 4 to 6.
The weekends had their own thing, right? But throughout the week, we sat down with Carlos and Sugar after each episode. Carlos was such a chill dude. Everything he had to say was positive and encouraging. And Sugar, well, she was well known for her cartoonishly high-pitched voice that drove parents nuts.
You guys all love Dragon Ball Z. This one, it's gonna be really, really cool tonight. It is entitled Dead Zone.
These were my people, man. The Zone was also hosted by a handful of different people before Carlos and Sugar stuck to it, but that would have been slightly before my time. I think I've only would have been catching the tail end of that by the time I started watching TV. Sugar left to pursue voice acting in 2007, and it's been hosted by Carlos ever since. He does have less involvement in it now that he's on Entertainment Tonight as well, but this dude will live on in my heart forever as that chill guy who hung out with me after every episode of SpongeBob or Fairly Odd Parents or Teen Titans or whatever else I was watching after school.
What?
And then there was the YTV voice guy.
Check it out Monday at 4 in The Zone.
To this day, it's still the same dude. Like, he's got one of the most iconic voices to anybody growing up in Canada. Whenever advertising every show, he'd always come up with the weirdest things to say about it.
I'm the voice of their commercials. You think they'd cut me some freaking slack, but no. You want to know what they said to me?
I'll have my people call your people.
Whatever.
While YTV had a gradual change over the years, Teletoon, on the other hand, kind of looked the same for a while and then had a massive shift in 2007. Before then, it usually looked like this. Bumpers were done with 2D animation, sometimes rather crude looking, a lot of motion tweens and stuff, and there was a number of different voice people as well, mostly doing cartoony and wacky voices for the commercials, right?
On Teletoon Saturdays, nothing beats an old-fashioned 2x4.
But then in 2007, everything changed. The logo went from this to this. It was sleeker, cooler, modernized, and the cast of many voice people were all replaced with Dan Petronijevic. I totally butchered that, I'm sure. Sorry, dude. This guy wasn't cartoonishly wacky like the announcers before. He was a little bit more chill and had a deeper tone to his voice.
Bunnies like Manicula and Bugs are super rad. They're both chill dudes. So he decided to bring them together along with some of their pals.
Even more so when he hosted the Detour.
At 11 o'clock, Lucy, daughter of the devil.
Man, the Detour bumpers were some next level shit. Look at this, dude. It was styling, it was weird, it was cool as hell. In my eyes, this is the very definition of radical. Even the transitions between blocks, like when Teletoon would end and the Detour would start, you got that viewer discretion warning.
The following program is intended for adults 18 and older. It may contain language, subject matter, violence, and/or sexual content that some viewers find offensive.
It was like a transmission from another planet, letting you know that the good shit was about to come up. And the transition back to Teletoon, that would happen at like 5 a.m., so nobody would ever see it. Even that had a level of care and time put into it. YTV had some dope bumpers too. Here's a handful of my favorites. Oh my god, you know what? Who could forget the CCA PSAs, dude? Yes, hey, what you watching? Me. Well, I'm just the TV. I mean, I'm not even human. You've got the remote control. You can change channels if you don't like what you're watching. You can flick me on and off, on and off. Whoa, I'm getting dizzy. See? You're smarter than me. I think I have this whole thing memorized because I would have seen it so many times as a kid. Nobody's good at everything, but everyone's good at something. What's your thing? That's one everybody remembers, mostly because,
Mom! Aiden cut me in half again!
This was a PSA company that I actually studied when I did my PSA semester in college. I think the one most people will probably remember is the Canadian House Hippo one. The whole point of that commercial is it starts with like this absurd documentary about tiny hippos that's obviously fake, and at the end it's like, well, you know, that was obviously fake. That's why you question what you see on TV. You know, you knew it couldn't be true, but nobody took that from it. Everyone I knew as a kid just wanted a pet house hippo. Man, I could do a whole video on the CCA. YTV and Teletoon rocked my world, man. Like, even when they weren't even showing shows, they were just being their own weird little thing with interviews and bumpers and a visual style that morphed and changed over the years. But yeah, that's pretty much the groundwork for what shaped Canadian television when I was younger. But now, why don't we take a look at some of my favorite shows that I grew up watching?
Lights, camera,
Being Ian. This one really shaped me into who I am now. It was a cartoon about a 12-year-old filmmaker who made movies with his friends, and that is exactly what I was at that age. I could relate to the show more than anything else on the air at the time. It spoke to me so personally. I still quote this show to this day.
Are you gonna talk? Or are you gonna chess? Chess isn't the verb. It is now.
The show was made by Ian James Corlett, who Americans may know as the voice of Mega Man in the 80s cartoon.
There's bound to be trouble if Wily's around.
And the original voice of Goku before Sean Chamel took over. And then Canadians might know him for voicing Andy Larkin in What's With Andy, and also making Yvonne of the Yukon. That one was kinda weird, but What's With Andy kicked ass. Kyle and Corey, these were Ian's older brothers. They were hilarious characters. This show just had a really good cast that made for some great moments and situations in comedy.
I bet he's trying to pretend he's not bothered so we'll get bored and leave him alone.
Then it's time we turn up the heat.
Leave the thermostat alone.
One episode is Ian pulling a prank on Kyle and Corey, setting them up with a fake treasure hunt that actually leads to a bunch of poison ivy. But they're so stupid they can't even find it.
Let's look for a shortcut through the dense bush. Look, a baby bear!
Let's pet it!
The actual animation in this one was pretty basic, heavily relying on motion tweens and stuff, but I've watched it again and I think the humor holds up pretty well. There's some great visual gags in there too. I love everybody's stretchy noodle arms. This one aired on YTV between 2005 and 2008, so I would have been about 11 or 12 when I first watched it.
Take that, psychopath!
And now, something from Teletoon. We have Kid Paddle. It was a show about 3 kids who loved going to the arcade. We had Kid, the troublemaker, Horace, the weird kid that would eat anything, and Big, the smart kid who liked to modify his game consoles. This was one of the first shows I ever watched that did a reasonably good job of accurately portraying kids' interest in video games. I mean, like, every time I would see a video game in an episode of Fairly Odd Parents or Jimmy Neutron or something, all I could ever think as a kid is, games don't work like that, or games aren't really like that at all. It always seemed like these shows were written by people that never played a video game and didn't know anything about them. But then Kid Paddle comes along and really nails what a kid who loved video games was really like. I mean, I often found myself not really being convinced by the amount of freedom these characters seemed to have in the arcade games they were in, but it's funny how that was. So many cartoons strictly depicted video games as overtly simple, like they were in the 80s. Hit the button, shoot the bad guys, and that's it. But then here was a show that was aware that modern video games had so much more to them. Adventures, a wide array of inventory, and different ways you can approach a situation. Oh, this show had some mad cool transitions too, and I love how every episode would end with the frame slowly zooming out as the character's final bits of dialogue played out, followed by one last comedic bit by a character on the black screen, and then wrapped up with... One episode I really fondly remember was one where they wanted to make a short film for a contest, and Kid explains how stop-motion animation works.
He's gotta walk, so you position his leg for the first step. And you shoot one frame. Then, you follow the movement and shoot another frame. And you keep doing that.
Careful, it's gonna fall.
I actually had no idea that's how this stuff was done as a kid. This taught me the basics of that process, and I was a huge fan of Knox Corner at the time, and understanding the magic behind it in that moment, it was amazing to me. I even made some of my own stop-motion stuff after seeing that episode. Oh, this has got to be from like 2005, man. I can't believe I still have this. Oh, and the scene where he shows his sister and his dad was too relatable, man. Like, I would always make stuff and show it to my dad, and he would have the exact same reaction. Like, I would pour my heart into the thing, hoping to get a great reaction from him, but he'd just be pissed off that I used his power tools and stuff as props.
My power drill!
I still think this one's a pretty great show, but unfortunately, finding this one in English online these days is pretty difficult. It was a France-Canadian production, so it's much easier to find in French. It was probably much more popular over there than it was here, so that probably explains why all the Kid Paddle games only saw French European releases. The artist of the comic it was based on was also French, so Kid Paddle's roots are more dominantly French than they are Canadian. If you can find it in English though, you'll probably recognize Big's voice.
It's all rough games and scary nights. I hate summer camp.
Yeah, that's Danny Brochu, the voice of Buster Baxter from Arthur.
Whoa, it must be worth millions.
Which, speaking of, was also partially Canadian produced. But if you're Canadian like me, you might also know him as the voice of Danny from... This show is about a prankster named Andy Larkin and his friend Danny, always getting into trouble, pulling pranks on people. It was based on the Just series of books by Andy Griffiths. I remember my friend Robbie was reading one of them in like grade 6, and he showed me that there's a part where he stubs his toe or something, and then there's like 4 or 6 full pages of bleeped out swearing. When I was 11, I thought that was like the funniest thing. Many episodes revolve around the planning and execution of an elaborate prank, which often went horribly wrong, and then Andy had to deal with the consequences.
In less than 1 hour, we'll be at the Paleontology Institute, and I still haven't thought of a way out of this mess. I'm finished. I may as well just move to Yellowknife.
I have to agree.
This ranges from covering the town in fake snow to try and get school canceled, to reversing the doors on the school so people can enter but can't leave. One episode has Andy pretending to be dead and nobody buys it, and they even put his dead body in a dunk tank. One of my favorite things about the show was during the first season where part of the theme song would change to describe what happened in that episode.
Hi, I'm Andy. If things go my way, I'll be pulling off the first man-made snow day. Started out as a prank, but then got way out of hand. See, now the whole town's shouting, hey, what's with Andy?
And before we move on, you can't talk about What's with Andy without mentioning Mush the pizza guy. He was such a good character.
I'll be back for you, honey. But you understand there's pizza that needs delivering.
Wayside, there was another Canadian one. I remember in like 3rd grade, our teacher read us the entire original Wayside novel, so when they made a cartoon out of it, I was really interested. I didn't really think it was amazing, but it did have some pretty great moments. So, there's a good chunk of what I watched as a kid when it came to more slice of life stuff, but Canada also had a lot of pretty badass action shows as well. Here's one Brady reminded me of. Shout out to you, Brady, because I never would have remembered this if you didn't bring it up. Skyland. It was a 3D skypunk series about a young girl with psychic powers and her older brother as they join a ragtag gang of sky pirates in their adventure to save their mother from an evil dictatorship. Like a lot of Canadian shows, this was a combined effort between Canada and France, but this one also had work done on it in Luxembourg as well. While I think the character models are a tad dated and the voice acting could be a little bit better, some of the cinematography in this show is absolutely gorgeous. I absolutely love how this show looks. I love the way the ships look, how they're tall and slender, and like, it just looks so different from everything else. Oh, and speaking of 3D shows, you can't forget Reboot.
My format, Guardian. To mend and defend. To defend my newfound friends, their hopes and dreams. To defend them from their enemies.
This was the very first of its kind. It was the first 3D television series ever made. And it was Canadian too. I'm pretty sure Americans did have this one, so you guys probably are pretty familiar with it. Beast Wars 2, same team made that one, though for some reason they called it Beasties here in Canada. I don't know why, because that sounds stupid as hell, and Beast Wars is a way better title for that. And if Skyland was Skypunk, then di-gata Defenders was Runepunk. This show was about a bunch of teenagers that used magical di-gata stones to summon spells to do battle with. Each character had a guardian, kind of like a Pokemon that would assist them in battle. They traveled the realm in search of the 4 spirit stones they need to keep an ancient being sealed away so it doesn't destroy humanity. It was a typical hero's journey cartoon. You know, they had a long quest ahead, they met tons of characters along the way. It was just really fun, and lots of badass action too. And later on into the series, they were able to channel their guardian's energy into wearable organic armor that would give them an edge in battle. It was so badass, especially Seth, like the rock armor, and he had that mask on. It was so cool, dude. The show had a magical fantasy setting, but there was also a blend of technology and machinery as well. Eric, the team's engineer, was even voiced by the Teletoon voice guy. And his little sister, voiced by Sugar from The Zone.
The sigil energy our stones draw from is found within the land itself. Over deep water, our stones have no power to draw on.
Oh yeah? So how come my power boots still work?
Because your brother is a genius and he included a backup power source that runs on reserve energy.
This show was really good at explaining the universe's rules and how these spells worked and what stakes their limitations would create. I'd say overall the tone was pretty comparable to something like Teen Titans. It had its darker moments, but overall it was pretty lighthearted. The humor in it has aged pretty well, I'd say. A lot of pretty good visual gags in there. I think the animation also holds up really well too, and that's probably because it was produced by Nelvana. These guys were the top dogs when it came to producing 2D Canadian animation. Babar, Rupert, Sticking Around, Pippi Longstocking, Ned Snoot, Sam and Max, Franklin, Rescue Heroes, George Shrinks, Maggie and the Ferocious Beast, Braceface, Redwall, all of which Nelvana had some part in producing, and all of which were at least partially Canadian. And if you want to ask me, I'd say one of the coolest shows they ever put out was Class of the Titans. It followed 7 teenage descendants of ancient Greek figures like Jason, Hercules, Artemis. Or is it Artemis? I don't know. They would channel the power of their ancestors. For example, Harry had Herculean strength because his ancestor was Hercules, and Odie, he had genius intellect because his ancestor was Odysseus. And then there was Neil, who got his unsufferable narcissism from, you guessed it, Narcissus. I hated Neil so much as a kid, but rewatching this now, I think Neil's the best character. Like, he's the comic relief, obviously, but it's not like he's not cowardly. He doesn't run away from fights. He can fight. He's just too lazy to because he's too busy looking at himself in the mirror. They attended a high school that was run by Greek gods who would season them into warriors so they could battle Cronus, the god of time, and whatever ancient Greek monsters he'd throw their way. Oh, I love Cronus' voice acting. His actor gave an amazing performance.
Why don't you two sit down, I offered her a deal that I wouldn't hurt you while she was gone. Don't make me break my promise.
The humor and writing were really great, and the characters were all lovable. And, of course, the animation is really good, too. It was just an all-around badass show. The episode where Harry battles the Hydra especially sticks out in my memory. That's one thing I loved about the show. It had the G rating, but it was not afraid of showing monsters getting their heads chopped off. Oh, here's another one I loved as a kid. It was actually produced in my hometown, too, in Nova Scotia. Delilah and Julie. Looking back on this one, the animation, it's really fluid, but the stills, they don't look very flattering. Trust me though, it looks fine in motion. It was about 2 secret agents going on missions and fighting crime. The secret headquarters even said somewhere in Nova Scotia. Seeing a slice of home on TV was always really nice, because like, the only thing from Nova Scotia is Trailer Park Boys. And that's all I hear about. And so when I was a kid, it was just nice seeing that on screen, right?
They're Delilah and Julius, and they're saving the world one crime at a time, baby.
Every single episode cold opened with the tail end of their previous mission. It gave the show a very energetic flow. One of the most cherished action series out of Canada, though, was easily Cyber 6. It was a noir series about a genetically engineered vigilante that fights crime and lives a double life, posing as a male in the real world to hide her identity. The animation in this one falls somewhere between DC Comics and Japanese anime, and it is absolutely phenomenal looking. There was a handful of Canadian shows that draw some influence from anime. Spider Riders, there was one. That one was actually co-produced and animated in Japan though, so unlike Avatar, which, you know, there's tons of debate over whether or not it should actually be considered anime, Spider Riders was quite literally a Canadian-Japanese anime. And credit where credit is due, that English intro is fire. The Japanese version had their own version of it, but in Canada, we had the Spider Riders rap. And it wasn't this one-piece quality stuff either. No. That's what happens when Americans give an anime a rap. This is what happens when Canada does it.
Spider Rider, if you true, then you could be too. It's cool, you can join our team, no matter how dark it seems. If you look at powers inside you, so strive to be a great rider. We're riding on, so now we're calling off.
Speaking of anime influence, Marathon. There was a company that was well known for its anime style, with shows like Martin Mystery and Totally Spies. I'm fairly certain these two did air in the US. Martin Mystery was badass as hell. It followed Martin, his stepsister Diana, and Java the Caveman as they solved bizarre mysteries involving ghosts, demons, aliens, monsters, all sorts of bizarre types. They worked for a secret organization called The Center, run by a woman codenamed Mom and her alien assistant Billy. In like every single episode, Martin completely destroys something in her office and then she has to deal with it. Martin was a fumbling moron, but he was really good at what he did, so she couldn't afford to fire him. Oh, I actually remember some people I knew did not appreciate their depiction of Nova Scotia, because there's an episode where they go to Antigonish and like, yeah, Nova Scotia has Scottish origins. I mean, Nova Scotia is literally New Scotland in Latin, right? But I've lived here all my life, and let me tell you, we're not Scottish. We don't have Scottish accents.
For a walk. That's fine, son. Just don't touch any trees.
There was this guy in my 6th grade class named Caleb who was so mad about this. I mean, I don't blame him. I mean, I got irrationally mad when I was in 6th grade when he told me that the GameCube was for babies, right? Having the show take place in a variety of Canadian locations was really nice, though. I mean, like, when most of the shows you watch are American cartoons, it's really not often you see geography closer to home. But yeah, anyway, they would be living their normal lives, attending high school, and then they get a call from the center and they'd have to find a nearby portal to quietly pass through. Sometimes they'll even work it into like a visual gag, right? Like this one episode where the portal appears in the fridge and Martin's just grabbing a bunch of food as he backs into it. Martin also had a bunch of gadgets that he would activate from his wristwatch, and the bit of animation they used for these sequences was so cool looking. Totally Spies actually had a pretty similar concept, come to think of it, but with espionage instead of the paranormal. Instead of the center, we had Whoop, and instead of paranormal investigators, we had Sam, Clover, and Alex, 3 spies who kicked ass with an array of gadgets. The 2 shows even had a crossover episode where Martin tries so hard to be cool and impress the girls, but they all think he's a loser, even though he's like this legitimate paranormal investigator with real expertise in his field, but he's such an idiot tryhard that they don't take him seriously at all.
Proof of the paranormal. How else can you explain footprints just ending?
That's how. The culprit hopped on his snowmobile.
And the idea of Jerry and Mom knowing each other was a really nice touch.
Martin's boss, Mom and I go way back.
Your mom is Martin's boss?
A mystery organization manager, MOM.
Totally Spies was a pretty rad show, but it was kinda notorious for having some odd scenes that could be construed as fetishism in a way, you know, like characters transforming into animals and stuff. I mean, depending on who you are, it's either gonna be ugh, or it's gonna be ooh. What am I going on about? And while it's pretty easy just to point fingers and go, that's weird, well, it is weird, it's actually really freaking weird, honestly, there's something fascinating to me about watching old shows and tracing that weird thing you kinda like back to it. And I say this with utmost maturity. I'm not trying to come off as weird or strange or anything, and I do apologize if I kinda breach some comfort zones, but it's just really fascinating to me how TV shapes us when we're young. Like, to these animators, it could have been something they weren't even thinking of. To them, it could have been just like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if this happened to this character? But then kids would see these things and they would feel things they don't understand, and that would lead to this butterfly effect in how they developed as a human being. For example, I know more than one person that kinda have a thing for giant girls because of episodes of shows like Archie's Weird Mysteries or Pokemon that would feature a gigantic female character. It's weird as hell, yeah, but you gotta admit, it's fascinating how television shapes us, whether we know it or not, and whether it's something like our sense of humor or our vocabularies, or something a little bit weird. I can't say for certain whether or not TV shaped me in that way, but I do think that Martin Mystery really helped shape my interest in the horror genre. It was a G-rated cartoon, but I feel like it really pushed that G rating. And I know that sounds weird, like you can push a PG or a 14, but how do you push a G rating? By having an attitude and writing that's digestible by children, but also having terrifying monsters and happenings. Like this one episode where everybody in the entire town vanishes, and the next day everyone's back, but they only repeat one phrase on loop, like they're NPCs filling a role.
Hey, what'll you have? Oh, cheeseburger.
Hello, I'm Diana, and this is...
Hey, what'll you have? Cheeseburger.
Some episodes were almost Twilight Zone in nature, and it was cool as hell.
Hey, what'll you have? Cheeseburger.
Come on!
Oh, that opening theme, man. Unlike most other cartoons at the time, it didn't have vocals that would explain to you what the show was about. Instead, it was just this eerie theremin. It was so cool. Another paranormal investigation show I loved watching was Ghost Trackers. It was a competition where teenagers had to go into a haunted house and try to find as much evidence of paranormal activity as they possibly could. They were even decked out with all of the legit equipment that real ghost hunters would use, and even though I didn't really believe in ghosts, it was still really cool, even pretty scary at the time as well. Oh, here's another spooky one I loved, Mystery Hunters. It was a documentary-style show about 2 kids who investigate bizarre happenings, and it was kind of creepy. I mean, they're dealing with real ghost encounters, creature sightings, people that claim to have really made contact with aliens or whatever. But while the first half of the episode would focus on documenting it, the second half they would try to explain it scientifically, even trying to recreate it sometimes. This really put me at ease as a child, and I think I can attribute my critical thinking of unexplainable happenings back to this show.
Remember, things aren't always what they seem.
Real good example. My bed used to vibrate at night and I had no idea why. And every time I'd Google it, the conclusion I'd always get was, it's a ghost. Like, are you serious? I remember this long Yahoo Answers thread, almost 100 answers about ghosts. But there was one reply that gave me a solid answer. Hey, is your bed up against the chimney? Because the furnace is probably just vibrating the chimney and that's probably just vibrating your bed. Yeah, my bed's up against a wall, and on the other side of that wall is the chimney. It was really that simple the whole time. Another live-action show I remember was Prank Patrol. It follows a new kid every episode as the show's host helps them devise, build, and execute an elaborate practical joke on their friends. I remember one episode had a kid tricking his friends into thinking he found like a superhero glove or something that would make things explode, and they had the real practical effects to back it up. It was really satisfying to see all of the engineering and building to these pranks, and then finally seeing it all come together at the end. On the topic of live action, there's a show called Zix Level 1, which was a live action and 3D animated hybrid following a group of friends who entered this digital world or something to fight bad guys. It was followed by 2 seasons titled Zix Level 2 and Zix Level 3. And who could forget? It was a game show for kids with this ridiculous host and tons of slime for kids who got the answers wrong. But they didn't just get slime poured on them, no, they got slime poured on them by the Punisher. Look at this guy, he looks like he could tear you in half. But instead he's on this kid's show pouring goo on people. It was so weird. So, you guys convinced? We had some killer programming up here in Canada, but keep in mind, this is just a small handful of favorites in a sea of awesome stuff that never made it south of the border, as far as I know, but that's not to say that every Canadian show is a banger. We did have some whatever stuff too. Some shows are just kind of weird, like Jacob Tutu. I wouldn't really even say that was a bad show, it's just kind of gross sometimes. Angela Anaconda, God, that's one I'm sure everyone knows about. Jesus, that thing was terrible. That's gotta be like the ugliest show I've ever seen in my life. God. Johnny Test is the shining example everybody uses as an excuse as to why Canadian shows suck, and it's funny because that one's not even entirely Canadian. I did some research, and yeah, while it is animated in Canada, the episodes are often still written and storyboarded by Americans, and then sent to Canada just for the actual animation to be done. So sometimes the actual writing and scenarios and jokes and stuff are still a result of the US, and I find it kinda unfair to entirely blame Canada for the poor direction. I mean, the lame Flash animation, sure, but like, it's less so that it's being animated in Canada is why the animation is cheap, more so that they decided to outsource the animation to save money, and the studio they hired just so happened to be Canadian. I mean, it's the same deal for Teen Titans Go. It was once animated traditionally, but now it's animated in Flash by a cheaper studio. Where that studio is does not matter. It doesn't suck because it's being animated in Canada, it's because the show's creators made the decision to do it more cheaply. If you want a real example of a bad Canadian show, Brady's Beasts. I hated that show as a kid. I thought it was so boring and ugly and bad. Monster by Mistake was another 3D one. I loved it as a kid, but looking back on it, I think it's only okay. It's about a kid who turns into a big blue monster every time he sneezes. If I do have to give it credit anywhere though, it's the theme song. Fun fact about this show, my friend Brandon used to vandalize the Wikipedia page for it so frequently that it got deleted. It's back up now, this was years ago, but good lord, Brandon. A lot of people I hear hated 16, and like, yeah, the animation kinda sucks ass, but this was one I really loved growing up. A lot of my friends did too. I think it was really good to have a show about older characters that dealt with a lot more mature teen stuff. Getting a job, having relationships, drama amongst your own friends, there was content in here that I would argue was valuable to people growing up. Total Drama, that was also by the same team. That one's kind of a guilty pleasure for me. It also had the more mature nature, you know, with the adult jokes and raunchier humor. Apparently this one got censored in the States though. There was this one episode where the challenge was to eat bull testicles, right? Which, yeah, that would be pretty gross to most people, but in the States, they just call them meatballs, so suddenly it makes no sense why nobody wants to eat these things. If there's one thing about the show that did age pretty well though, it's the theme song. One really cool thing about the show airing internationally was that different countries had a different winner. Owen won the first season in Canada, but in some other countries like Australia, Gwen was actually the winner. How cool is that? So yeah, there's a handful of shows that I grew up watching, but keep in mind, I'm not the only Canadian guy out there that's on YouTube. No, there's plenty of other people that do what I do that also had Canadian TV shape them as well. So, guys, what do we got?
I've been Canadian my whole life, and at one point in that life, I watched a very good Canadian-made show called 16. It was a nice show talking about the problems teenagers may face at that coming-of-age time of their lives. At that age, I thought that's exactly what being 16 would be like, being in the mall, hanging with your friends, and everyone having a weird, stereotypical personality. The content matter was actually pretty genuine. Sometimes it had some gross-out humor, sometimes the humor was a bit immature, but out of all the shows I watched at that age, this was the most genuine and actually involved me personally with the characters as you saw their growth and relationships bloom. It would be unfortunate, however, that after 16, the studio would work on the Total Drama series.
It wasn't necessarily even one of my favorites, but one of the shows that really impacted me was Carl Squared. It was about this, for lack of a better word, rad teenage dude named Carl who sent away a letter in the mail with his DNA and got a clone back. That wasn't the part of the show that really got me. Carl's personality, he loved skateboarding. He had a video camera, which him and his friend Jamie, they would love to make just stupid teenager videos and I think music videos as well, which really piqued my interest because that was the first time I'd seen anyone really use a video camera in a TV show, I think, other than in B and Ian, which was also an incredible show. He had a blog, and he would always open up the episode with his problem, and he would ask his audience what he should do about it. I always thought that was super cool, that he had this connection with some audience over the internet who he could just beckon for help at any given point and get an answer back, which I think probably interested me in becoming a YouTuber later on in life. Really great show. Loved it a lot.
I used to love shows by Mainframe Entertainment, the studio behind cool cartoons like Beast Wars and Reboot. I could go on for days about why Reboot was like one of the best cartoons out there. The show had so much charm and wit and likable characters that went through so many changes throughout the series, and even a villain who still gives me nightmares to this day. And although the show was initially marketed towards kids, in the later seasons of Reboot, the writers were given a lot more creative liberties with their show and ended up taking things in a much more darker tone. And it was really cool to see how the story evolved into something much more complex from where it started. And then we got this really intense cliffhanger that failed to tie up all the loose ends of the show. And for many years, myself and other fans waited for some sort of explanation or conclusion or resolve to the cliffhanger. And instead, all we got was a live-action reboot of Reboot. Yeah, because that's what we wanted.
So one show I wanted to talk about was Weird Years. This show's about the Dorkovich family moving from the fictional Cryobia to Happy Valley, Labrador, trying to fit into the new world. And this one's obscure even by Canadian standards. It was on at 8:30 on weeknights in 2006-07, but then fell off the face of the earth for a decade until someone uploaded most of the episodes online. I rewatched everything that was available, and the show lived up to the weird, no doubt, but it also had a lot of heart and genuinity. Though despite its lighthearted tone and child-friendly look, this show and some of its subject matter is not for children. It earns its PG rating. There was that one episode where the neighbor's wife had a serious lust for Donko, and I remember seeing several other episodes when I was younger and going, whoa, back up, I didn't think they'd show that, and rewatching them now, they had my jaw dropping just like back then. But it really surprised me how much I grew to like all the members of the family and the crazy situations they found themselves in. By the way, the mother character Magda, she is absolutely adorable, especially when she gets mad. Oh, also, I'd like to give a shout out to Urban Vermin. No one remembers that, but I've got some episodes saved on tape that I ought to share.
So, there you go. Here's a big chunk of Canadian stuff for you guys. Keep in mind, though, this is just a small drop in the bucket. There's even more rad Canadian shows out there. And if you grew up in Canada like me, seriously, guys, comment below all about the Canadian shows you guys love growing up. And for the majority of you guys outside of Canada, well, maybe you might have recognized some of this stuff, but hopefully some of it was new, and I hope you found some of it maybe kind of interesting. A lot of this stuff really shaped me as a person, and it's always amazing to look back on it. And that's why I think it's a crying shame that a lot of these shows are completely overlooked in favor of this cynicism towards Canadian programming based on a handful of examples. It just kind of breaks my heart to see a lot of these things that shaped me into the human being I am now ignored because of a couple of bad shows came from the same country. And I'm not trying to call anybody out here, I'm really not. It's just, I don't know, I guess I'm just expressing a general disappointment. And if any of those channels end up watching this video or catch wind of the things said in this video, well then, I challenge and encourage you to more deeply explore the world of Canadian programming. Try to find some more diamonds in the rough. Maybe something I brought up in this video, or perhaps something totally new. And that's exactly what this is to a lot of people. It's new. Like, it's amazing to me that a lot of these things I grew up watching are totally foreign to a lot of people. And while a lot of Canadians might find disappointment in that, personally, I feel really grateful. Like, I got to grow up watching Being Ian. I got to grow up with a show that, as a juvenile filmmaker, I could really relate to. I got to grow up with di-gata Defenders and Kid Paddle and What's with Andy. Not a lot of people on this planet did, but I did. How lucky was that? Man, if I could go back in time and watch all of these shows for the first time ever again, I'd give the world for it, man. Value your time as a kid, because it doesn't last long.
When you're growing up so fast, you gotta make the good times last. Life began after school. When did they change all the rules?